Hey you guys, happy Thursday and welcome to day 5 of palette week, where every single day for 7 days straight I am posting some sort of palette themed content. So if you like palette themed content or panning content, I hope you'll consider subscribing before moving on. But today we are going to be reflecting like we do most Thursdays on this channel. We're doing a TBT style video, and today we're throwing it back to the previous 3 years most used eyeshadow palettes. So I have been tracking how many times I use each eyeshadow palette in my collection consistently since 2020, every single day for the full year. And I went back and looked at my top 5 most used palettes from 2020, 2021, and 2022. And we're gonna talk about it today. I was actually so incredibly surprised when I went back to look at some of my most used palettes. I was like, I don't remember that being a most used palette. I was shocked at how many times I've used some of these palettes, and some of my most used palettes are no longer in my collection. So if you're interested on reflecting on my top 5 most used palettes for the last 3 years, stay tuned. First, as I said, if you have yet to subscribe to my channel and you like project painting content, palette themed content, or just chit-chatting about makeup, I'd love if you consider subscribing before moving on. And other than that, let's jump into the video. Okay, you guys, I'm filming at night and I feel like I look very dark. So if my lighting is just awry, then it's just fine. It's just gonna have to be okay. I'm okay with it. I hope you're okay with it. Okay, let's start with 2020 and work our way to the closest date. So there are 2 palettes that were my most used palettes in 2020 that are no longer in my collection. First being the ABH Mario palette, which that palette I struggled so hard to get myself to declutter. I purchased that obviously when that palette released. I think it was 2016, I might be wrong. And I just decluttered that palette finally, like August of last year. So I had that palette for 6 years, and it definitely was like starting to lose some of its quality towards the end of its life. It was in my palettes on their last 2 raw series for 2 total years because I could not get myself to declutter that palette. I ended up using it a total of 42 times throughout the course of 2020. One other thing I found really interesting is my top 5 palettes definitely got the most use in 2020 in terms of like number of uses, obviously. And then in 2021, my top used palettes got like less usage. Like my top used palette in 2020 had 55 uses. My top used palette in 2021 had 36 uses. And then my top used palette in 2022 did have 44 uses. When we get to 2022, you'll see that 2022 is just an outlier of a year. And I really hope it remains just an outlier of a year. Anyway, jumping back into it, my 4th most used palette in 2020 was my Dose of Colors Baked Browns palette. And when I pulled this, or when I saw it, I was like, oh yeah, like I do remember using this palette so much that year. But this, I think, was a palette that went unused in my collection all of 2022. I have 2 really large palettes in it, and I would love to get, like I'm close to hitting pan. If I said I had 2 really large palettes, I meant I have 2 really large pans in this palette. I feel like I'm very close to pan here. I would love, maybe this should be a pan that palette for 2023. Pending how this year's pan that palette goes, which we'll be talking about this year's pan that palette in this video, maybe I could do that. I already have like a very good head start on this, but I used this 44 times, if I didn't mention, in 2020, which does make sense. I mean, this is just like a comfort palette, very easy to use. I love brown, neutral and warm brown shades. They're all mattes. I love mattes and shimmers, but not surprised to see that. And honestly, just kind of makes me sad that that palette got so much use in 2020 and then like barely got used the last couple of years. So I definitely want to show that palette some more love this year. My 3rd most used palette in 2020 is also a palette I no longer have in my collection. It is the ColourPop Sweet Peach palette. I do think I've depotted a couple of shades that I loved from that palette. I think not the Sweet Peach, just the peach one, the little 9-pan palette. There were a couple of shades I absolutely loved in that palette that I ended up depotting and have in a Z palette. So I did end up keeping a couple of those shades, but that palette I think was in my Pan Those Eyeshadows at least twice that year, which does explain some of the use on that palette. I did end up reaching for that a total of 48 times, which like just knowing my eyeshadow palette collection and my typical usage, like 44 sounds like so much, especially for a palette that I no longer have in my collection, but I do still have some of my favorite shades from that palette. So my second most used palette in 2020 is actually my Pan That palette this year, and it is the ABH Sultry palette. I reached this palette a total of 53 times in 2020, which is actually wild to me now that I am doing the Pan That palette and tracking my progress. Like 53 times, plus we're gonna get to 2021, and I got a good number of uses in 2021 as well, and now it's getting so much use. Like this palette has been used so many times in its lifetime. Granted, I do absolutely adore this palette. I think it is such a great just staple palette. You've got warm shades, you've got neutral shades, you've got cool shades, you've got really, really beautiful shimmer shades in this. It's just all around a great palette. And it has definitely gotten a lot of love. This is absolutely still a favorite palette in my collection and has been clearly for the last few years in my collection, as it continues to be one of my most used palettes, if not my most used palette ever, to be honest with you. And then my most used palette of 2020, I was so surprised by, so surprised. It is the Color Grain Queen of Hearts palette. And the reason I was so surprised by this is, well, first of all, I used this 55 times. 55 times, which I'm actually really happy about, because this was a palette I was thinking about and have thought about decluttering many times, because I was so excited to get this palette, and I just feel like I'm not as inspired by this palette as I thought I was going to be. I think maybe I let the hype get to me, and it just, like, I do think it's a great palette, don't get me wrong, but I just don't get as excited to reach for this palette as I thought that I was going to. So I'm super excited to see that this actually has gotten quite a bit of use in its lifetime with me. I have a pan in the shade Crown, but because of the packaging, you really can't tell. And this was going in at least one, if not two projects in 2020 at one point or another. So reflecting back, I'm like, okay, like that does actually make sense. But I was so shocked to see this as my top used palette of 2020, but also the amount of times that I had used it. So then moving on to 2021, palettes 4 and 5, the top fourth and fifth most used palettes in my collection in 2021. We have a repeat, we have the ABH Sultry. So I reached for the ABH Jackie and the ABH Sultry each 26 times in 2021. Again, not a whole lot more to say about ABH Sultry other than clearly it is my most used palette ever, like ever, except for maybe the Urban Decay Naked 2 palette, like in college, because I think I've owned that twice because I like used my favorite shade completely up. But circa the present, ABH Sultry is by far my most used palette, even before bringing it into my Pan That palette. But y'all know how much I love the ABH Jackie palette, so I have been doing this thing with this palette where I feel like I have to reserve this palette for special occasions and can't wear it on a day-to-day basis because I love it so much, and I do that thing which just really doesn't make sense. So I really tried to focus on using this more in 2021 because I was sad at the end of 2020 to see that this was not a most used palette, because this is one of the products that I am just like a broken record, cannot shut up about and have not been able to shut up about for years. So I was really sad that this just had not gotten that much use. I'm very happy to see that I used it 26 times in 2021, and I'm hoping to use this at least 20 or more times this year as well, because this is still one of my favorite palettes in my collection. My third most used palette in 2021, I was quite surprised to see, but then I was like, okay, I do remember why, but it's my Melt Mary Jane palette, and I reached for this a total of 29 times. I do have a pan in this shade right here, and this is primarily the shade that I reached for when I was using it those 29 times. I was using it as a brow powder. Back in the day when I used a brow powder more, I am back into using a brow powder because I'm trying to get through the shade Dystopian from the ABH Sultry palette. But that is primarily what I was using this palette for. If you are following along in my No Pan Left Behind series, this palette was just a completed palette in that series, but I was saying how I'm considering whether or not I want to declutter this palette because it's such a frustrating palette to use, but every single time I actually complete my look with this palette, I love it. It's just so messy because these two shades specifically, which are really beautiful, are just so crumbly. Like you literally, I'm not exaggerating, you dip your brush in and crumbles like get on my bathroom counter when I like, it is so messy, but end result, always beautiful. There, you just have to be so careful. It's very finicky. I don't think I'll end up decluttering this palette because I just don't think I'm ready to yet. But I didn't remember this being one of my most used palettes of 2021. So when I looked back, I was like, oh, interesting. My second most used palette of 2021 was my Urban Decay Born to Run palette. And I believe this is because this was in my palettes on their last 2 Raw series. And I was using this a ton. I have 3 pans in this eyeshadow palette, which is seriously a feat because these are very firmly pressed and very, very deep pans. So I reached for this palette a total of 33 times in 2021. And I actually recently reached for this palette again in January of this year. I obviously didn't end up decluttering this at the end of my palettes on their last 2 Raw series because after using it those 33 times, I just didn't feel like I was ready to. But then I didn't use this palette much last year. And I pulled this back out to kind of create my favorite look with this palette in January of this year. And I just was not that impressed. I feel like my quality is starting to kind of go downhill. There's definitely some shades in this palette that I just have never been super impressed with. And I actually think during my next palette declutter, this is going to be a palette that I finally end up saying goodbye to. So, you know, maybe I'll be eating my words when I actually do my declutter, but that is how I'm feeling at this point in time. And then my most used palette of 2021, I actually don't have in my collection anymore. It is the Too Faced Palm Spring Dreams palette. I got this palette in a boxy charm. I used it a bunch. I used it 36 times in 2021. I ended up hitting pan on the lid setting shade, and then I just didn't care to use the palette anymore because it just wasn't that special in my opinion. I think it was, if I'm not mistaken, in my Pan Those eyeshadows, and that's why I hit pan on that shade. But aside from that, I just like didn't care for the palette here or there. It wasn't like a bad palette, but it just wasn't something super special in my collection. My eyeshadow palette collection has been growing, and that just, you know, it just didn't have a place in my palette collection anymore. I haven't missed it. In fact, I totally forgot about that palette until I pulled this up and I was like, oh yeah, I forgot I owned that and used it 36 times in 2021. That brings us to 2022. 2022 was, what a year. What a year 2022 was. If I could like black out a year of memory, I think it would be 2022. And I feel like my most used palettes kind of reflect just like the oddness, out of characterness of the year. I know that those aren't really words. So I wasn't wearing makeup. I did not wear makeup as consistently. In fact, middle to end of last year, I was like, do I even like makeup anymore, aside from just like in a utilitarian manner of like putting a face on every day, but like, do I even enjoy the creative process of makeup anymore? And I was like kind of starting to panic because I was like, I have this huge makeup collection and like, do I even like makeup anymore? But I do love makeup, and I have found myself again and found my love of makeup again, which is just so happy for me. But as I looked back on my most used palettes of 2022, I was just laughing because I was like, yep, none of it really makes sense except for like maybe 1, maybe 2. And I was like, but 2022 in general just didn't make sense. So it is what it is. So I actually have 6 palettes to share because my 5th and 6th most used palettes, if you will, were a tie for how many times they got used. And those are my Urban Decay Naked Wild West palette as well as my Dose of Colors Friendcation. Both I used 19 times. I did end up hitting a pan on the shade Standoff in the Naked Wild West palette. I did just share a video, day 1 of palette week was palettes I'm considering decluttering or palettes on the chopping block. And this is actually one of them. And I was really surprised when I was pulling the palettes for this video and I was like, this was one of my most used palettes of 2022. But it does make sense because I hit pan on the lid setting shade. This shade Cowboy Rick came cracked, so it just keeps getting messier and messier. I just like, now that I'm like looking at it and I know it was like one of my most used palettes, I'm like, do I want to actually declutter this? Maybe not, but I was very surprised to see that. Wasn't as surprised to see my Dose of Colors Friendcation palette. So this palette is and has been in my palettes on the last two Raw series the last 2 years. I did not do that series again this year just because I didn't necessarily feel like it was making sense for me to do anymore, but I do have a chopping block, which is kind of similar, which I just posted. This shade has completely shattered and I've repressed it like 2 times, so it gets a little bit messy. My palette is very messy. I used this 19 times as mentioned. I love this eyeshadow palette. This is another one I feel like over the years I have felt like I needed to reserve this palette for special occasions, and I have busted this palette out on just about every special occasion that I have had. Country concerts, I don't even have to think about it. This is the palette that I'm wearing. I don't know what it is about country concerts and the Dose of Colors Friendcation palette. I mean, the two go together like fireball shots in country concerts go together, you know? I don't have a single pan in this palette yet. So I would love to have a pan in this palette by the end of the year. Like, would love to. I have some good, like, disruptions and disturbances on these 3 shades right here. I mean, I feel like with a little effort, maybe on the champagne shade, I could also hit a pan. Glad that this is one of my most used palettes, although I only reached for it 19 times last year. Would love to see this maybe be another most used palette this year. Only time will tell though. Next we have my Artist Couture Supreme Nudes, which I am happy to see, and I don't feel like this is like surprising because this is one of my favorite palettes in my collection. This is just a comfort palette, easy to use, can create any look that is going to make me feel comfortable and confident. This has come traveling with me. This is something that I also feel like, you know, if I ever retire this could be like a country concert replacement. I don't know what it is about this color story that I just absolutely love. Will continue to use this. I'm hoping to see this as one of my most used palettes again this year because this is a tippity top favorite palette in my collection, so I am happy to see that my favorites are ending up as some of my most used palettes. My third most used palette of 2022 is my ColourPop Pisces in the Sky. This was going in my Pan Those Eyeshadows when I was doing Pan Those Eyeshadows last year, and I reached for this palette a total of 29 times. I was working on this shade right here. There's a bit of a dip going in this, but I still feel like I'm so far away from pan. So this takes some effort to get through. I actually really enjoy the ColourPop quads. I think they're really great quality, and I really like this shade as just, if I just want one shadow in my crease and like run out to the door, this is a perfect shade for that. Maybe I could hit pan on this year, perhaps, we'll see. But I remember dedicating quite some time to this palette last year and then not being successful and being so frustrated with that. In fact, it may have been this palette that was part of the reason I decided that Pan Those Eyeshadows was just no longer for me. My second most used palette of last year, a little bit surprising to me, but also I really came to love this palette. It's the Sigma Enchanted palette, and I reached for this also 29 times. So these two, I guess, were tied. I actually am interested in picking up this Sigma New Mod palette. The color story is just so pretty. I definitely don't need it, but the color story is so pretty. So I do have I have a pan in the shade Quartz, which is just the lid setting shade. It definitely took some effort to get to pan in this. Like, the pans are actually pretty deep in these Sigma shadows. I really enjoyed the shade Metamorphosis last year, as well as Budding and Cosmos. In fact, I feel like I need to pull this out. I'm gonna set this aside. I feel like I need to pull this out and use this to create some March appropriate green looks. But I absolutely just love this palette. I think the color story is actually kind of unique and just makes me feel really creatively inspired. I just feel like there's a lot of variety and options with this palette, so hopefully I get more use out of that this year as well. And then my top most used palette of last year was the ColourPop Lil Ray of Sunshine. Reached for this a total of 44 times, and I do have a pan in the lid setting shade right here. This palette was also going in my palettes on their last two my Pan Those Eyeshadows Pan Those Eyeshadows series last year, and it took me forever to hit pan on this. It's an all matte palette. I love this palette. I cannot wait to use this again, like fall time, just because I feel like this gives me very fall vibes. Like, I'm very excited to reach for this yellow dandelion sort of shade. But I was very, like, this doesn't stand out as like a palette I think to reach for every day, or an everyday palette. So I was surprised. And I don't think this is like a tippity top favorite in my collection. That's why, like, when I look at my most used versus my favorite palettes, I'm like, wow, I really don't always use my favorite palettes. But those are my top 5 palettes from the last 3 years. Do you guys track your most used palettes? What are your most used palettes the last few years? Do you feel like they align with your favorite palettes, or is it kind of all over the map like it seems to be with me? I'm so excited to continue to track my palette usage and kind of see where we end at the end of this year. I am doing the No Pan Left Behind series as mentioned for the first time this year, and it's just got me really excited to get to know some of my palettes a little bit better. I feel like sometimes with my eyeshadow collection, I just hone in on like what's comfortable, like the shades that are comfortable for me, and then like the rest of the palette gets neglected. But with the No Pan Left Behind, I'm really forced to like figure out how to make every shade work at least one time. So I've had a lot of fun with that. I feel like it's going really well for me. That really has nothing to do with this video, but this was super fun to reflect on my most used palettes. Leave me your comments down below. Let me know what eyeshadow content you want to see next from me, your palette themed content. I love getting your guys' feedback. Thank you so much for sticking around to watch today's video, for supporting me, for supporting Palette Week. I love you guys so much, and I will catch you in tomorrow's video. Bye.